Hello, my name is Julie Blackpeart, and along with my co-host Lorraine Brooks, we welcome you to Health Center Dialogues from Downstate Medical Center. Today we have a very special guest, Ms. Shondell Goldsmith. We welcome her. She is the EEO and Title IX advisor at Downstate's Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Welcome, Shondell.
Thank you.
Welcome, Lorraine.
Thank you, Julie. It's good to be here again, co-hosting another edition of Health Center Dialogues.
Wonderful.
And I think today is going to be a very interesting show because there's a lot of talk about sexual assault and sexual harassment and gender-based bias, I guess we can call it, right?
Yeah.
And so, Shondell, we invited you here today to give us a little information about exactly what all of that means. And Julie said that you were the Title IX advisor to Downstate, so it sounds very important. Why don't you tell us exactly what that means and what Title IX is?
Good question. So let me go back a little bit. First of all, I work in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and I want to just talk a little bit about that office because there are many people who don't really know we exist or what we do. So the Office of Diversity and Inclusion is institutionally responsible for making sure that there's no discrimination against the students or staff based on certain federal rights that deal with gender, age, race, religion, national origin, skin color, etc. So Title IX comes under that. EEO is Equal Employment Opportunity, and Title IX is a specific federal legislation which prohibits discrimination based on, they say, sex, meaning gender, in education and educational facilities which receive federal funding. So that's where Title IX comes in, and it's very important. I want to say also that it's a very broad legislation, meaning that many people who may have some familiarity with it think that it only deals with students, and it's actually much broader than that. It applies to students, it applies to employees, it applies to certain third parties, including job applicants, students seeking admission. So if you are in the process of applying for admission or applying for employment and you feel that during that process you've been treated unfairly because of your gender or your gender identity or sexual orientation or perceived gender identity, those are issues that my office would investigate and that I would investigate.
So it could be a perception. It doesn't necessarily have to be an actual fact.
Right.
If I perceive that I'm being treated differently because I'm a member of a certain gender or a certain group, that's enough to
Well, when I say gender
generate
perception, I mean that, let's say I was born a female, but I,
have transitioned.
right.
Okay.
Okay.
And the discrimination is based on your perception of what my gender is or should be. That's what I mean when I say gender perception.
So the perception on the part of the
Right.
perpetrator, if you will.
Right.
It could be something real, say for instance like an employee who feels like her male counterpart who's been there just as long as she has with a similar educational background is getting more money than she is, or something like that. Okay.
Right, or a male employee who feels that he's in a department that is dominated by predominated by females, and he feels that he may have academic credentials or work experience which is more than his counterparts, yet he is making substantially less, or he is not given the same opportunities to participate in departmental trainings or meetings or things of that extent. That's all gender-based, and those are all issues that we would investigate, as well as, and I just want to talk about, Title IX also speaks to the pregnant and parenting student. Now, this is not specific to employees, but it speaks to the pregnant or parenting student, and that they should be able to fully participate in the academic experience, irrespective of the fact that they may be pregnant or parenting. So if I need to take time off due to the pregnancy or because of the parenting, that shouldn't be held against me. And let's say I am at a point, I may be full into the academic semester, but may have to, not complete an exam or, the course because I'm giving birth. When I return, I should be put in the same position that I was when I left as well.
And that goes for male and female too.
Male and female,
paternity
right,
and maternity,
right.
And
even childcare
too.
Right, exactly.
And women who are lactating and need to go and take time from class for a moment to go pump and that sort of thing.
Exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
We had an issue a few years ago of a student who was using a breast pump, and it was long before you got here. I think probably even before Kevin was here.
Okay.
But the issue was that there was no place for her to go. There was no place where she felt like she had any privacy. And actually other women, oddly enough, and I say oddly enough because I don't understand why anybody would complain, but women were complaining that she was using the pump in the women's room,
Right.
and that it was disruptive
Really?
to them, which
Yeah.
I don't understand. But the point was, we needed to find a place where this person could go and have some privacy to express herself. And so we did. We located a bathroom that was off the beaten track,
Right.
I think, in the basement, and that's where there was a designated area, and we had a sign put on the door. I don't think we've had a case since then,
Since
but
then.
that's an interesting
Right.
scenario, because you wouldn't necessarily think that something like that would be
Right.
legislated, or would,
And it's
that there would be
it
protection.
is a protected activity. It is. And the thing that you mentioned that's also interesting that we didn't speak to is that you said that it was women that were the ones who had an issue, and the gender bias can be between two people of the same sex.
I have a question concerning, two-pronged question.
Okay.
You say you do an investigation, so
Right.
that means that other people have to be involved in this process.
Right.
You have to speak to other people, perhaps witnesses or whatever, corroborating stories. So that's the first thing. What about confidentiality in that process? If I'm someone who, is it possible for me to come to you and say, Shondell, this, and this happened to me, but I don't want you to investigate it. I just kind of want to tell you that it happened. So is it possible for me to not have it go any further than that? And if it does go further than that, then how is my confidentiality or my privacy protected in that process?
So here's what's important, Lorraine. One of the duties of the Title IX coordinator is to make sure that members of the campus community understand what their resources are. And so on our website, as well as when I do new student orientation and new employee orientation, one of the things that I tell them, and also if you come into my office, before we even get into any specifics, the first thing I like to do is to let people know exactly what my role is and what I can do and what I can't do and what I have to do. And what I mean by that is that I'm a responsible employee in terms of, if you report certain things to me, I'm bound to investigate them.
Okay.
So the reason why I have the conversation and why I want to make sure people understand their resources is because we have individuals on campus that you can speak to who don't have that duty. Right, so if you're a student,
Actually, I'm one of those
and I was
people,
going to
right.
say that. If you're a student, I would direct you to student counseling. If you're an employee, I would direct them to Lorraine, employee assistance program. So, we want people to know.
So
what the limit-
confidentiality and privacy are not really the same
thing.
No, they're not.
Because
I think that's important. for
yeah,
people to
and I think it's
understand.
important for them to understand that in order, and I tell them this as well, in order to fully investigate a complaint, we would have to, at minimum, speak to the person who is the respondent that you're complaining about, and depending on what's alleged, we may need to speak to witness. It really depends, but I can honestly say that we try to limit the number of people involved to those who really need to be involved, right? Because we don't want to sort of re-traumatize someone by, turning this into a bigger spectacle or involving more people than, need.
So if I'm
to know.
complaining against Julie, you would have to. It would never happen.
Right,
But
of
if
course
I had a
not.
complaint against Julie, you would have to. You would be obligated to speak to Julie and get
Right.
her side of.
It depends.
Okay.
Again, so let me say this. Like I was saying before, it depends on what is alleged. So what happens is it's a balancing act, and that's why this is a job that, not for the faint of heart, and, you really have to take time with each specific case. We're going to look at certain factors. So we're going to look at pattern. And that's the reason why you have a Title IX coordinator. You really want to have one person or a small group of individuals who are sort of monitoring what's going on campus. Because you may come to me, Lorraine, and say, this happened with Julie, and you know what, Shondell, I'm discussing it with you or Ms. Goldsmith, but I'm not sure I want to do anything. I kind of told her that I didn't appreciate it, and I don't think it's going to happen again. So actually, the more I think about it, I don't want to do anything about it. And I may know, because of the work that I do, that you're not the only person who's come to me about her.
Okay.
There may be a
Oh,
pattern
okay.
there. And so although you feel like it's a one-time thing and you've handled it to your satisfaction, I may know that there's a pattern there. So we look at pattern. We look at, was a weapon used? We look at, were there minors involved? So there's a bunch of different factors that I have. And that's not an exhaustive list. I'm just giving you an example of the sort of things that I look at to determine, because I take confidentiality and privacy into account, and I take the victim's empowerment into account. So for me to really take a stand where I'm going to investigate something that someone has specifically said I don't want you to, we really have to look at, is the incident that's alleged, one that could potentially put the greater campus at harm. Because the worst thing that could happen is that you become re-victimized, or this person goes on to victimize someone else, and we knew about it and we did nothing.
Right. It kind of reminds me a little bit, being in healthcare, that, and this is a medical facility, and then we have CHIRP, which is the College of Health-Related Professions. We are also obligate reporters, so that if somebody comes to me, if I'm seeing a patient, or if I have a suspicion that a child has been abused in some way, shape, or form, we have to report those things, right? So these instances are not just at the college level, they're also at what other levels is this Title IX affecting?
That's right. Title IX, as I keep saying, it's very broad. It's not just at the college level. College level is what happens to be in the media these days, but it actually extends K through 12. Okay, so, you know, they have the same responsibilities that we do, Title IX coordinator, to effectively and, you know, within a timely period of time to investigate these allegations. They have the same responsibilities that we do.
What about retaliation? I mean, you know, a lot of times people are afraid to come forward because they fear what might happen to them as a result of making this complaint. And Julie, you were talking before about why did it take so long for some people to come forward. And I think part of the reason, well, I'm just going to speak, you know, as a counselor, part of the psychology of being a victim is that these people who prey on, especially people who are pedophiles or who prey on a particular group of people, they establish trust with the victim, and that's really the big deal, to establish some trust so that you know you break down the boundaries and you break down the resistance and you break down the defensiveness. So a lot of times people don't come forward because there's that trust factor. They do feel that they have to protect the victim. It's a very odd kind of psychology. It's that the prisoners of war sometimes have that too, where they feel that they have to protect their abuser once that trust is established. But also it could be fear of retaliation, and I've had many people who've come to me with issues who say, well, I don't want you to you know, go forward with this because I'm complaining about Dr. So-and-so who's the head of whatever, and I don't feel that it's going to go anywhere, and I'm going to be singled out and I'm going to be treated differently as a result of making this complaint. So I think fear is a big part of it.
No, I agree with that, but there's some twist to that too. You know, say for instance, if you're a student and say for instance you're out doing your clinicals or something, and some doctor that you work with is approaching you inappropriately, and let's say you're afraid to say something, that's one thing because you don't want to get a bad grade or whatever have you. So you have a faction of people who won't say anything, like you say, for those fears. And then our society, I don't know, over the years things change, you know. Are we so sexualized now that we find that certain things are okay and that we just kind of gloss them over when we really, really shouldn't? And should I say something if I know somebody's doing something to somebody else? Do I come to you, or just do I encourage an individual who I see, who I believe maybe is being harassed by somebody, to come and talk to you about it?
Well, it's both, and I speak to that in any orientation presentations that I give. It's both. So one of the things I would say is a responsibility of every member of the campus, I say, is that we encourage you that if you've been a victim of sexual assault or sexual harassment, any kind of violence on campus, that you report it, or if you have knowledge of it, that you report it. But one thing that I have to stress, and I've been trying to stress this very much in my presentations, is that if you're a supervisor or someone in a position of authority where you're instructing others, you actually have to report it.
What's the consequence if you don't?
Well, I mean, the consequence if you don't, I mean, we could be sending you for discipline, depending on, you know, the nature of what we find out later on and what you knew. Because the truth is that the way the government sees it, and the way that the governing body, which would be the United States Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, who is the enforcement arm who enforces Title IX, if you are supervising someone and you know about it, their impression and their feeling is that then SUNY Downstate knows about it.
Because we're really here to protect
the exactly.
Yeah, so, we're here to protect the students.
So while I encourage everyone to report, you know, supervisors and managers must report it. They must report it. And I think, and I just want to speak to the retaliation piece, and this comes up not just in Title IX cases, but any sort of, it could be race, it could be national origin, skin color, age, that we have a no retaliation policy. And sometimes people are like, okay, we see that, but what does that really mean? And what I say to them is that, you know, if you don't tell me, I don't know. Because they come in and they say, Ms. Goldsmith, you know, I'm going to go back to my department, or I'm going to go back, you know, to my, clinical rotation. And what I want to know is, can you really do something, or is this just going to make it worse? What's really going to happen? And I say to them, you have to let me know what's going on. So from the time we start the investigation, when we actually start speaking to witnesses and the other party, we technically start to let the person who filed the complaint know, because that's the point in time where you would have to let me know whether or not there's something that's changed within your department based on that. Because when I call you in, Julie, because Lorraine filed the complaint, the first thing I'm going to tell you is that we have a no retaliation policy and that she should not be treated any differently. She has a right to file this complaint, and if we find out that something has changed in the terms and conditions of her employment because of filing the complaint, you may be subject to discipline yourself based on that, the retaliation piece, irrespective of the actual underlying complaint.
Isn't it hard, though, to establish the timeline with that? If I make a complaint on Thursday,
right,
and then she says something that I don't like the following Monday, could I infer that it was because I made the complaint on Thursday, or maybe it's just a coincidence? You know what I mean?
That might be a
really
little bit
hard
different.
That's
to
tricky,
say.
but we're going to look at, so we're going to look at some of the pattern of, your interactions before, and also let's say now you're suddenly being sent to, for discipline to labor relations. And we're going to look at, has there been a history of that before? Have you had the same types of interactions and nothing has happened, and now suddenly, you're being called, to bear for that. So, we're going to look at a bunch of different scenarios to determine whether or not it is in fact retaliation. I mean, it's not an easy case to prove, but one thing I do tell people is that it's easier to prove retaliation in some cases than the actual underlying complaint.
Okay, so what about, we hear a lot in the news about these stories about, and once again I have to digress and say it's not just young women, but it's mostly young women that we hear about, unfortunately. They go to, let's say for instance on the campus here over in the dorm, say for instance somebody's having a little get together in their room, and then there's alcohol or some other kind of drug is introduced, and then so-called she's out of it. And I mean, would those kinds of things come under the same,
They definitely would.
Yeah, because there's a lot of times we're blaming the victim kind of thing.
Which we're trying to get away from.
Yeah, we're trying to get away from. But then, like I said, sometimes say, oh, well, you were in a situation where you knew this kind of thing would happen, or, like, how do we get around that? I mean, it's just all this blaming back and forth. I mean.
Well, it's good that you mentioned that, because I think one of the things that we should discuss is the fact that SUNY, the State University of New York as a whole is, being a leader in, addressing sexual assault and sexual violence on campus. And we're in the process now of working on some policies. So as of December 1st, there are uniform SUNY policies that have to be followed on each SUNY campus that having to deal with the policies and procedures for dealing with sexual assault and sexual violence on campus. And one of the issues and one of the policies deals with amnesty, where drug and alcohol use is a part of the equation. So let's say, for instance, you as the victim were under the influence, or you, Lorraine, were a bystander or witness, and you want to complain, but you're afraid now because you're like, well, if I go and complain, am I going to be sanctioned now? Am I going to be subject to discipline because of that? I want to complain, but I don't want to be put on probation or reprimanded or have something noted in my record. So this new policy, it's an amnesty policy, meaning that we will not pursue the student conduct part of it that has to deal with the alcohol or drug use of the victim or of a witness.
When it involves a sexual assault.
Right.
That's interesting.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Because albeit that those behaviors do need to be quelled, the harassment and what happened and the assault is, tantamount really to that.
And there's a chilling effect. I think there's a chilling effect if you want to report, but you're afraid of those repercussions and how that will come into play. So I think that's a very important step that we're taking to make sure that we make the process as open as possible.
Go ahead.
And let me just say one thing. I want to make this clear as well for anyone listening who may be working at Downstate, that policy really does only apply to students. That doesn't apply to employees.
The alcohol and drug amnesty.
Okay.
Okay. Well, that's good to know too. I was going to say the concept of consent, comes into play in terms of the alcohol and drug use.
Right.
I know that the new policy says that consent has to be active and not passive.
Right.
So if you are not conscious, or you're not.
If you're not conscious, if you're not of age,
you're not, I don't know what the word, you're not totally sober, or you're not totally in a position to make an affirmative consent, that factors into it as well. So if anybody, as you say, is under 17, is it?
Yeah.
So if you're under 17, you automatically cannot
Consent, right.
If you are under the influence of something and you're not conscious or you're not coherent,
Right.
you cannot consent. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people, you say that this thing about blaming the victims, and we hear that all the time. Well,
Right.
what was she doing there at
Right.
3
Yeah.
o'clock in the morning?
Right.
Or why was she, wearing that outfit?
Right.
Or,
why was she at this frat party?
Why was she?
Exactly.
Yeah,
You
you
knew that
know,
there
you
would
knew
be
the drugs and
Right.
the drinking and whatever
Yeah.
have you. And even if you are known to be somebody who drinks or whatever have you, nowadays what they're sleeping with roofies
Yeah.
and all kinds of
Right.
things that you don't always
Exactly.
know that you're going to end up being underneath
Right.
the influence.
Right. Exactly.
So it becomes a whole different dynamic.
Yeah.
And so this policy, would that cover a student or a faculty member, say for instance, if you're off campus, or is it strictly just on the campus, like within the campus boundaries?
If you're off campus and it's off campus at a student, like at a university sponsored activity,
Okay.
or if it's two people related to the campus, then yes, our policies would apply.
Okay.
And I just wanted to go back quickly to the affirmative consent. That's actually a new policy, as I was talking about the new S.U.N.Y policies, the affirmative consent. It's important because I think when you think about historically some of the trainings people get, you hear no means no. Right? And the problem with no means no is that it requires you to say no or to somehow, show that, you don't want this to happen. Whereas with affirmative consent, the onus is not on the victim. It's on the person initiating that sexual contact for them to get consent. It has to be clear and it has to be unambiguous.
Well, I'm going to say finally.
Yeah, it's a
Hello?
good thing.
I
It's
mean,
a good
that's
thing.
what-
Yeah, it's very important.
Now you say you come and you speak to all of the students at SUNY Downstate during their orientation
Right.
period? Okay.
As well as new employees, which
And new
happens twice
employees.
a month, right?
They're getting so much information, they might not really retain everything that you're saying. So is there something that the school is doing on an ongoing basis, I don't know, every 6 months or so, where they're going to get this renewed information? They might not remember.
Right.
So what are we doing?
Well, this is true, and this is something that we think about. We do the ongoing orientations, and what we're working on now is having sort of an online training that people can do on demand as they need it. When issues come up, the kind of campus that we have right now, people are working shifts sometimes, students are, they need to have access to information all the time. So we have our online resources that we're working on putting into effect, as well as we want to start having some teach-ins for members of the staff and faculty who are in a position that they're supervisor or manager, and understanding what their requirements are. As well as some of the S.U.N.Y policies that will be put into place. One of them is the campus climate survey, and the campus climate survey, which the actual survey instrument hasn't been created yet, but when it is fully ready, what's going to happen is it's a uniform campus climate survey that will be administered on each S.U.N.Y campus, and it's going to be asking questions surrounding understanding of Title IX. Do you know what your resources are on campus? Have you been a victim of sexual assault or sexual violence on campus? And if so, how did you feel about the university response?
Okay,
Things like that.
So what are some of those resources? Are there pamphlets?
So
how
right,
do they-
we have pamphlets, and when I say resources, I mean letting people know some of the resources on campus and off. So in terms of reporting, right, someone may want someone to speak to, they may not want an investigation to take place, so we would direct them. If they're an employee, I would direct them to Lorraine, to Employee Assistance Program. If you're a student, I would send you to student counseling, as well as there's off campus as well, resources that you could use. And also, if you want to file a complaint, but you feel like, what, it's happened here, it happened at Downstate, and I don't feel comfortable with you investigating it. I want an external person. So you have the right to go, and we would give you this information. It could be the local district attorney's office, special victims unit. It could be the NYPD, the local police precinct. And it could also be the United States Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights. They are the agency that is, enforcing Title IX. Okay. So you have that option to go directly to them with your complaint, and they would, depending on what's alleged, they would launch an investigation. So you have many options, and one of the things that the Title IX coordinator does, and will continue to do, is to let the campus know what their options are, as well as letting individuals who come into the office know what their options are, because we don't want anyone to feel that they have to file a complaint with our office, or they have to file a complaint at all if they just want someone to speak to. So it's all about empowering victims and everyone on campus and giving them options.
Okay.
So we have information on our website. So you can go to, if you're on SUNY Downstate, it's the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. If you go under policies, our information is there. We have pamphlets and web and booklets that we distribute throughout the campus. But what we're looking to do coming up hopefully in the next academic year, we want to have some sort of online training, similar to when we do our some of the mandatory online trainings that we have now. And the reason for that is, as you said, when you're speaking to people, and it's, new students, new employees, they just want to get the information and they really want to get out. They're thinking at that point, does this information really even apply to me? Why am I? It's never, it's never going to happen to me. So why do I need to know this? So we want the online training so that they can, when they need the information, it's there. And then also, because of the kind of campus we have, our office is really like a 9 to 5, 9 to 6 type of office. If you're working, a certain shift and something happens, we want you to have access to training and information that's there for you when you need it. So we're working on having some kind of online training to enable anyone on campus who has questions or concerns, that the information is there.
Now, would that be in the beginning when you first come onto campus, or would that be at some designated point? Because I kind of feel like people need a little bit of a refresher. I mean,
definitely.
Whether you get it or not, and it's sunk in at the very beginning, but then let's say you're here, like for our program, we're here 2 years and 3 months, and somewhere in there, if nothing happens, nobody's thinking about it. So you might want to, is there going to be some sort of a program, like every so now and then, like every once a year, every 6 months, there's some kind of something that everybody would know about, or anything like that in place yet?
Yeah, well, that's what we're working on. So we're working on having a program where we even have invited speakers to come in and talk about issues that are related, having posters and things around campus, and maybe, information that's given out throughout the year, and also, sort of like teach-ins for especially members of the community who will be in a position of, as I said before, supervising, or mentoring someone, that they know what their responsibilities are. And that's something we want to do on an ongoing basis, because I think a lot of people may not have that information and know what their responsibilities are. So we're working on that now.
Yep. Well, we're coming close to running out of time, but I just want to make sure that people know how they can get in touch with you, because a lot of people who are going to be watching this show are going to be students and employees and staff and third-party people. So is there a place where they can get in touch with you, a phone number, an email address, a website that you want to mention?
Definitely. So it's Shondell Goldsmith.
How do you spell Shondell?
SHAUNDELLE .goldsmith, GOLDSMITH @ downstate.edu. That's my email address. And to speak to me directly, it's 718-270-1738. And also, you can get information about all of our policies and resources on the Office of Diversity and Inclusion website.
Shondell, thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Julie. Thank you, Lorraine.
Very welcome.
Julie, another great interview.
Another great
thank
show.
You so
Indeed,
much.
indeed. We want people to know that this is important. It's not just on the SUNY Downstate campus. It's on every school campus. These are mandates. They're there to protect everybody. And people just really need to be safe and think very carefully about where they're going, what they're doing,
and who they're doing it with.
Yes, who they're doing it
Absolutely.
with. Who they're doing it with.